Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak tonight. It's a pleasure to be here, if not travelling around the M25 in the rain, but yeah. And you've asked me to speak about the events in Chile in 1973, and there's a massive amount to say on it. So I'm going to try and do quite a short introduction, and then people can ask questions, but also you can go away and read more. There's a very good article in Socialism Today this month by Tony Samwa, the secretary of our International, who worked in Chile in the underground under the dictatorship, but writes about the history. Or he's also about to produce a book. So you're going to have an opportunity to go into this in more depth than I can tonight. But it is really important that we discuss it. It's not just about 1973. There's a whole history you could cover, but I'm going to talk briefly about the events from 1970 to 1973. And they're inspiring, they're tragic, they're enraging. And most importantly, they're full of lessons for the successful socialist transformation of society that still apply today, 50 years on. When I became a Marxist, as we were talking about earlier in the mid-1980s, these events weren't that long ago, and we discussed them all the time. But inevitably, it's 50 years, so it has kind of faded a bit, and most of a younger generation of people becoming socialists probably don't know much about the shenanigans that took place in Chile. But it's extremely important. So, first of all, the basic facts. On the 4th of September 1970, Salvador Allende, who was the candidate of the Popular Unity, was elected president with 36% of the vote in Chile. He described himself as a Marxist, and he formed a government with a 6-party coalition, and the major parties were the Socialist Party, and actually he was on the right of that party, and also the Chilean Communist Party. It's worth saying, because you might now think, oh, a Communist Party, that means it was really left-wing, but actually it's a bit more complicated than that. Internationally then, that was still in the era where the Soviet Union existed, and it was not genuine socialism. It was still based on a planned economy, a very distorted form of a planned economy, but it had become a brutal dictatorship. And the communist parties around the world generally followed the Moscow line. And the Moscow line was not to want revolutionary upsurges in different countries, not least because they didn't want revolutionary upsurges in their own countries, but also because they wanted to have kind of a stable situation with the Western capitalist countries. They didn't want to upset them by the working class taking power in capitalist countries. And actually, the communists internationally tended to point towards Chile and contrast it to France 1968, which, if you think about it, had only been 5 years earlier, when 10 million workers occupied the factories, not just one factory, in a huge revolutionary movement, and could have taken power if it wasn't for the betrayal, in reality, of the Communist Party leaders at that point in time. So they pointed to Chile, and what they said about Chile is, this is great. We've got the election of this left government, and in alliance with the progressive capitalist parties and forces, we can gradually move in the direction of socialism without threatening the capitalists too much or upsetting them too much. That was the essence of their position. And the government did move in a socialist direction. This is not a story of a Keir Starmer type government that came to power and represented the interests of the capitalist class. Far from it. They took all kinds of measures. They nationalised the banks, coal, iron, nitrate. In particular, they nationalised the copper industry, which was big US-owned conglomerates in the main, and was responsible for 80% of Chilean exports, so was kind of the major factor in the economy. And they also introduced a whole number of reforms. I don't know how many of you read in The Socialist a couple of weeks ago, but Hugo, one of our comrades in Chile today, who joined as a young man under the dictatorship, but gives his memories of being a little kid when Allende was first elected. And they went from having no milk to getting half a litre of milk every day in every household. And that made a gigantic difference to people's lives. And that's his memory as a kid, that all of a sudden they got enough milk to drink. So they carried out all kinds of progressive reforms. But then, on the 11th of September 1973, and this is the original 11th of September tragedy, horror that took place, the army, backed by the CIA, carried out a brutal coup. There were many thousands of people killed, tens of thousands of people tortured, and you had the establishment of the Pinochet dictatorship, which lasted, finally went in 1990. He was a big mate of Maggie Thatcher. He pioneered the neoliberal privatisation policies that later swept the world. They were pioneered by the brutal dictatorship in Chile, by the so-called, the doctrine of the so-called Chicago Boys. So it's a horrible story, but it isn't a story that had to end that way. There was nothing inevitable about it. Like I said before, this was not about a leadership that betrayed the working class in the sense of acting in the interests of the capitalists. Allende died heroically trying to defend the presidential palace in the course of the coup. He gave a last message out to the population, and the new generation of young people in Chile today, drawing socialist conclusions, rightly carry popular unity demos, flags on the demonstrations, and point to Allende as a hero, because he was heroic in sense of what he did. But as the title of the Socialism Today article says, heroism was not enough. It's not just enough to be a good socialist and to want to improve people's lives. You've got to understand how to overthrow capitalism and build a new socialist order. We used to have a cartoonist back in the 1980s, Alan Hardman, who was a great cartoonist. There's a famous cartoon by him which sums up Chile, because it's a picture of the capitalist class represented as a saber-toothed tiger, and then there's a left-wing government trying to gently pull out its claws one by one. And really, that was the approach of the government. It was to gradually try and reform capitalism. They didn't understand. They nationalised big chunks of the economy, but they never broke the power of the capitalist class. The capitalist class still had the commanding heights of the economy. There wasn't a democratic socialist plan of production. And in particular, they didn't understand the character of the capitalist state. You know, we get told, don't we, including here in Britain, oh, the law courts, the judges, the police, they're neutral. They're there for the good of everybody. They make sure that we get justice. But actually, it ain't true, as you probably have noticed. And ultimately, they represent the interests of the capitalist state. And if capitalism is under threat, the capitalists would always rather rule by democratic means if they can. But if it's a choice between giving up their wealth and power, their ownership of this system, and moving to dictatorship, they will choose moving to dictatorship every time if they can get away with it. So the enemy that the Chilean working class faced was not just US imperialism, although it was definitely US imperialism, but it was also the Chilean capitalist class and elite as well, domestically. And that was almost willfully not understood by most of the leaders of the movement. So to give you an example, early on in this process, in 1970, then the commander-in-chief of the Chilean military, a bloke called Schneider, was assassinated. It's since been definitively shown that he was assassinated by the CIA. They organised it, they were behind it. He was not a left-winger, but he had said, we will respect the results of the election. He was opposed to the idea of a military coup against an Allende government, and that's why he was assassinated. What conclusion did the governing parties draw from this? There was mass horror at the assassination of this general. So the conclusion that they drew is, well, after making that mistake and all that mass horror against it, they'd never do such a thing again. So they drew, like, dramatically the opposite conclusion of what was necessary from the situation. And at every stage, Allende and the government sought to stop a coup by pacifying the military, by pacifying the capitalist class. That was their strategy. So in August 1973, Pinochet was brought into the cabinet as the commander-in-chief of the army, and a month later the coup took place. Now, it's not just historical hindsight that allows us to say that was a really terrible idea. We knew it at the time, on the other side of the world. If you read the front page of The Militant from 1973, from when that took place, the headline was, Chile, Army re-enters cabinet, and the subhead was, catastrophe threatens unless the workers are armed. It was absolutely obvious what was going to take place. And it wasn't just obvious to us, it was obvious to the working class in Chile. They understood what was taking place. The working class in Chile had taken part in a revolutionary process over at least 3 years since the government had been elected. It was developing prior to that, and they increasingly, on the basis of their own experience in the course of that revolutionary process, understood what was necessary and what was needed. So you saw the biggest demonstration in Chilean history, over 1 million workers marching on the presidential palace, shouting, Allende, Allende, the people will defend you. We are the popular power. And they didn't just march. Before the coup, they tried other methods, the capitalist class, to undermine the government. So they had, for example, a kind of business strike. The truck owners organised a stoppage, and they were trying to starve the government out, make sure that nobody got any goods, that people didn't receive the basic necessities, in the hope of undermining popular support for the government. And the working class organised against it. From below, actually, all of the parties in the government initially opposed those moves to organise from below because they saw it as a bit of a threat to them. They weren't very keen on it. But it took place from below. You got the development of things that were called the cordones industriales, apologies for my Spanish accent, which were in the industrial belt, elected committees of workers that came together and coordinated. And you also had things called the People's Supply Committees in the shanty towns that organised the distribution of goods to people, that even implemented price controls at different stages. So they organised to cut across the bosses trying to get people stuff by just saying, we're going to take it. We're going to take it from the factories and we're going to organise it being distributed to the masses. It is a similar process. It takes place to some degree or other in every revolution. But it is similar to what happened with the Soviets in Russia, in the development of the Russian Revolution, where the working class throws up its own organs of struggle initially to take the struggle forward, but they are also potentially the building blocks for a new society. And you can see that. They were starting to organise an alternative power to fight back against the attacks by the capitalist class. And the cordones were in advance of the government. So, for example, they declared, we support the Allende government insofar as it interprets the struggles and mobilisations of the workers. They demanded expropriation of all companies over a certain size and for workers' control of production via delegates' councils. So they supported everything that Allende was doing, but they were saying, you've got to go further. We need more than this. And that's the direction in which they were pushing. This was an element of what we call dual power, again, which is something that happens in the course of a revolution. So you get the development of the working class beginning to build a new society, to take power into their hands, but not yet having decisively overthrown the old order. The old state capitalist machine has not been broken, the capitalist power has not been broken. And that can't go on indefinitely. In the end, it's got to tip one way or the other. And unfortunately, of course, in Chile, it tipped in the direction of a tragedy and a brutal crushing of the revolution. Could that have been different? The cordones only developed so far. There was a limit to how far they developed. They didn't fully link up nationally. They didn't organise to become an alternative power beyond a certain point to the government. And and they tended to spring up in defence of the government against the attacks of the capitalists, but then to get a bit more passive again once the immediate threat was over. So there were kind of limits to how far they developed. And also, essentially, then they didn't begin to try and organise amongst the rank and file of the armed forces. Because, you know, the generals ordered the crushing of the government, the brutal military coup. But most of the soldiers were ordinary working class blokes. And so there could have been an attempt to organise to try and split the state machine prior to what took place. So they didn't go all the way. But let's be clear, they went a long way. That biggest march in Chilean history that I've just described, that was earlier on. At that stage, they were saying, we will defend you. In the months before the coup, they had demos of hundreds of thousands of strong that were saying the people's armed will defend your government. Give us weapons. They understood what was going to happen and they were demanding weapons in order to prevent the crushing of the revolution. So I suppose what you can say is there was no lack of heroism at all. There was no lack of militancy, determination by the working class. Really all that was lacking is that none of the left parties, and there were other left parties that I've not had time to mention, and lots of them played a good role in different ways, but none of them had drawn all the conclusions about what is necessary to transform society. If you look at what took place in Russia in 1917, the Bolshevik Party were a small minority before the revolution, but they took the leadership of the working class by winning the arguments about what was needed. And that's why the Soviets led a successful transformation of society. Without that, it wouldn't have been completed. You had the Kordones, but you didn't have an equivalent party of the Bolshevik Party. And of course, such a party has to be international, appealing to the support of the working class around the world. So as a result of that, it did end in this brutal, tragic defeat. But let's be clear, sorry, ignore that phone call. Let's be clear, in the last decade, as I said, young people in Chile are being radicalised again, are beginning to look for a socialist alternative. They did not permanently crush the Chilean working class. And actually, the reason the dictatorship ended was because of the increasing workers' opposition to it that took place and our members were part of building under the dictatorship. Now, to bring it to here, to Britain, to the relevance today, does any of this matter today? Well, it doesn't just apply to Chile. Don't want to draw a simple comparison, because it's not the same, but there are comparisons to be drawn with our little experience of not even getting a left-wing government, but having a left-wing leader of the Labour Party. Let's remember, when Corbyn was first elected, then we did see a whole number of army generals talking about how they would not implement the policies of a Corbyn government. Reports in Afghanistan of soldiers having Corbyn's face on their targets when they were shooting and so on. The military were making quite clear that they did not want to go along with what a Corbyn government might do. And that's a little warning of what the capitalist class will always be prepared to do if they had to. For them, democracy is secondary. Keeping power is primary. Does that mean we can't change society? Absolutely not. A country like Britain today, the working class is the overwhelming majority. There are groups of people who now consider themselves part of the working class, like the consultants, who were certainly mainly voting Tory not very long ago. There is huge potential support for a left-wing government. And the generals might have one idea, but the rank and file of the army would have another. Let's remember at the beginning of the national pay dispute, the national pay wave of disputes, the army generals were intervening to say, do not use the army to replace striking workers. They weren't doing that because they want to stand up for striking workers. They were doing that because they were worried about revolt within the army, who were extremely low paid, if they'd gone down that road. So absolutely, we could have a peaceful socialist transformation in society in Britain. We can elect a socialist government, and it can carry through a socialist transformation of society, but only if we learn the lessons of Chile, which is you cannot just do it bit by bit. You've got to mobilise the working class, the majority of the population, to break the levers of power that the capitalist class hold and begin to build a new, genuine, democratic, socialist society. So I'll leave it there. Very good points made in the discussion, and just on those last points, because I think they're very important. US, we live in a capitalist world where not all capitalist countries or capitalist classes are equal, are they? It's dominated by a few huge imperialist powers. Once it was British imperialism, now we're like a third-rate imperialist power. It's US imperialism that dominates the globe. And so dealing with those questions of the role of international capital, because you're absolutely right, they were determined to try and break the revolution. They were terrified of the idea of socialism in their backyard, as John said, and they acted accordingly, first by economic means, by the blockade and so on. But again, as John said in the discussion, the government got more popular. There was an understanding that the government was delivering what it could to improve the lives of working class people, and the things they weren't getting were the fault of the Chilean bosses and US imperialism. That was understood by the population. So that wasn't working, and at a certain point they moved towards backing the coup. So what conclusions do we draw from that? It's why we're internationalists. In the end, you can't build a socialist society just in one country. You can make a start, but you can't do more than that. You've got to spread it around the world, but also international solidarity is a very powerful thing. And if you watch that Nay Passaran film without crying, then you're a better man or woman than me. It's a fantastic film. It's just a little bit of ordinary workers showing solidarity. But if you look back to the Russian Revolution, for example, they had shed loads of imperialist armies attacking them to try and crush the revolution. Why did they pull out? They pulled out because their soldiers were being infected with socialist ideas and they were worried about it spreading. So international solidarity is a real thing. And there was huge solidarity in the US amongst the working class, which could have been appealed to. But that's why in the Socialist Party, we're not just the Socialist Party. We're part of the Committee for Workers International, because you've got to try and build a party like ours that's determined to fight for a new society, not just in one country, but around the world. And that's especially important if you're in the neo-colonial world. We maybe have a little bit easier in an imperialist power like Britain, but if you imagine that US imperialism wouldn't be bothered about Britain going socialist, you're under an illusion. And therefore, the need to appeal to the US working class would also apply to us as well. So that's on that. And then on their programme, look, their programme had loads of good stuff in it. It's not that they didn't do good things. It's just that they hadn't drawn all the conclusions about what was necessary to win. And they thought, and they were being told by lots of other forces, including the communist parties internationally, look, the answer is there are progressive bourgeois, you work with them, the state can be neutralised if you don't go too quickly. And they followed that advice. And that was the mistake. John's right. Even now, I read The Economist article on it, which first of all sort of said, possibly we were slightly over the top for backing the coup back in 1973, because of course they did. It's all right now talking nicely about, oh, they went a bit over the top, but at the time they wanted to defend their system and they backed it to the hilt. But the other thing they said is, well, really, if they'd had a more gradual and collaborative approach, it wouldn't have happened. What does that mean? It means if they hadn't nationalised the US-owned copper industry. But how could they have qualitatively improved the lives of the Chilean masses without nationalising? They had no choice but to go down that path. But then you've got to follow it through to its conclusion. On some of the other points that came up quickly, just because John was talking about the football stadium, where all these thousands of people were murdered. A few months later, FIFA played a football match in there. A world match was played in the football stadium in early 74. Russia boycotted it, yeah, but I mean, there was international solidarity from working class people, but the capitalist institutions around the world were, oh, what's going on here? Nothing to worry about. Carry on as normal. John raised the question of whether it was fascist. And we wouldn't just... Fascism has got a particular kind of scientific meaning for Marxists, in the sense of being a mass movement of the enraged kind of lower depths of society and the middle classes in particular. And because it's a mass movement, it's got the ability to completely crush, temporarily, the organisations of the working class. That's what happened in Germany under the Nazis. This didn't go that far. It was more of a classic military coup. They suffered brutal repression, but the workers continued to organise underground, and quite quickly that began to get more momentum and so on. But it definitely had fascist elements, let's be clear about it, as any military dictatorship does. They use fascist methods to brutally torture, they don't just rely on the military, but they have their own goon squads that go around acting in a fascist way and so on. So we wouldn't describe it as fascist, but that's not saying it wasn't horrific, because it absolutely was. Then just the important question, this issue of dual power, and what do we mean by it? Because that is a very important question. And I suppose day to day, who runs society? The capitalist class do. They're in the driving seat. Even if we elect left-wing politicians in some area, unless they take decisive action, the capitalist class still own industry, they still run the state, so the capitalist class runs society. But we are a potential power that could run society, and most of the time we don't know it. But there are times when workers start to realise that. It's happened in British history. If you look back to the 1926 general strike, people go on all-out strike action to defeat the government. Well, you might start with just an all-out strike, but then you have to start organising things, particularly in parts of the country, in the north, in Wales. The local, what we now call the trades councils, were organising society. They were saying, right, we've got to get food to these people, and they were checking the traffic. You can come through. No, you're a scab, you're a boss, you can't come through. They were starting to organise society. And that then is an element of dual power, isn't it? Who's running society? Is it the workers or is it the bosses? And particularly if those, whatever form they take, it's different in every revolution, Soviets, workers' committees, trades councils, whatever they're called, they start linking up together nationally and organising, then more and more they're running society. But the reason it's dual power is because unless you take the decisive action, unless you nationalise the major kind of commanding heights of the economy, unless you take the power, you get rid of the old police force and army, and you start to build a new democratic workers' state, then eventually the bosses are going to pick when you're at your weakest and fight back. So that's what we mean by the idea of dual power, and it is a thing that happens in the course of every revolutionary process to one degree or another. But our job, as John said, is to learn the lessons of all the times it didn't get followed through to its conclusion and make sure that we succeed next time around. And then John also raised, Paul raised important points on what's going on in Chile now, because it's a long story. You should get a whole other extra speech on that, because actually there's been a few things happen. There have been massive movements. In the period just before the pandemic, there were huge class movements that shook Chilean society, started by the young people, but not only the young people, started actually by the young people refusing to pay their metro fares and saying that older people shouldn't have to pay their metro fares either, and just it was an uprising. And there was little elements of dual power even in that, because they started raiding the chemist shops and delivering drugs to the poor who needed them, in terms of people who needed medicines and so on. So it was a big movement. And out of that, you had the election of a left-wing leader of the country who has not behaved like Allende, but has behaved like Tony Blair, or, honestly, he's done nothing. And this is somebody who'd come from the youth movements, who'd been elected on this wave. Now, part of the movement was for a new constitution, the idea of a constituent assembly, because even though they had a transition to democracy, the constitution was written in the Pinochet era. It's not a really democratic constitution. So that was a big mood. But actually, as a result of having this government came to power, which really has betrayed the working class, and then organised the Constituent Assembly to not be genuinely democratic, but a few hand-picked people discussing it, and then combining the kind of worst forms of identity politics in the sense of saying it's really important that the different indigenous peoples have representation and the different oppressed minorities. Well, we agree with all of that, but you do that, and then at the same time you do nothing to improve the living conditions of the majority, you're creating a culture war. So that's the basis on which there's been, amongst older sections of the population, a certain move to the right at this point in time. It's not actually the previous experience, it's the failures of the more recent wave of radicalisation. But this is not the depth of a dictatorship coming to power. They've still got this formally left-wing government. You could get a more right-wing government next time, but it's part of the process, really, of the development of a new generation, and then learning, not just holding up posters saying Allende was a great man, but actually learning the lessons of that era, of the kind of party they need this time to successfully transform society. So I'll leave it there.